At 67, Walter Hale knew the sound a tractor made when something was wrong. A loose belt had a slap to it. A failing bearing whined. Bad fuel made an engine cough and stumble before it found its rhythm. But the sound coming from the old John Deere that morning was worse than all of them. It was nothing. Walter turned the key again. The starter clicked once, then silence. He stayed in the seat for several seconds. One hand wrapped around the steering wheel, staring through the dusty windshield at a field that stretched nearly half a mile toward the cottonwoods. 3 weeks earlier, his larger tractor had died beside the equipment shed. Transmission trouble. Walter had already pulled the floor panel, drained the oil, and spent 2 evenings underneath it with a flashlight between his teeth. He hadn't fixed it. Now the second tractor was sitting dead in the middle of the north field, and behind Walter were 900 acres. He climbed down slowly. His right knee stiffened halfway to the ground, forcing him to grip the handrail until the pain eased. 20 years earlier, he would have jumped from the last step. He didn't do that anymore. Walter opened the side panel and looked inside. Battery cable, fuel line, starter. He checked the obvious things first, because obvious things were cheap. The battery terminal was tight. There was fuel in the tank. He tapped the starter housing with the wooden handle of a wrench, climbed back into the cab, and turned the key. Click. Nothing. Walter looked across the field. The grass along the fence line was already high. Another field still needed attention. A section of pasture on the western side had fencing down. The lower ground near the creek had been getting wetter every spring, while the ridge above it seemed to dry faster every summer. For years, those had been separate problems. That morning they became one problem. There was only one man left to deal with them. Walter's oldest son lived 6 hours away and had a construction job he couldn't leave. His daughter had moved to another state years ago. The seasonal hand Walter used to call had taken steady work at a grain operation 40 miles north. Nobody had abandoned him cruelly. Life had simply moved on. Walter hadn't. He was still there. 900 acres. 2 tractors. Neither one running. He pulled an old red handkerchief from his back pocket and wiped grease from his fingers. Selling had been mentioned more than once. A neighbor had asked about renting the north fields. A land buyer had left 2 messages. His son had tried to make the argument gently. You don't have to prove anything. Dad. Walter knew that. At least he thought he did. The problem wasn't pride. Not entirely. The problem was that he had spent most of his adult life believing a farm told you when it was finished. Wells dried. Soil gave out. Debt swallowed the margins. Buildings collapsed faster than you could repair them. But standing beside the dead tractor, Walter couldn't tell whether the farm was finished or whether the way he had been farming it was. He walked back toward the house. Without the tractor, the distance felt different. Longer. Slower. For the first time in years, Walter wasn't crossing the farm at 8 miles an hour behind glass. He was walking through it, halfway back. He stopped. Near the edge of a neglected pasture was a strip of grass noticeably greener than the ground around it. Walter had driven past that place hundreds of times. He couldn't remember ever stopping there. He looked toward the dead tractor behind him, then back at the grass. There were 900 acres waiting for work. At 67, Walter finally understood one thing. He could no longer work all of them. What he didn't know yet was that this would be the first decision that saved the farm. Walter had been offered money for the farm before, enough that most men his age would have sat down with a calculator. Walter never did. The first offer came after a developer began buying property south of the county road. Another came from a neighboring operation, looking for more ground. A third arrived in an envelope from a company Walter had never heard of. He left all 3 on the kitchen table until the paper curled at the edges. It wasn't because the farm was especially beautiful. Some of it was. Much of it wasn't. 900 acres sounded impressive when someone said the number quickly. On the ground. It was something else. Some acres were still worth planting. Some were better suited to hay. The cattle used what pasture remained dependable. Then there were the pieces Walter kept working mostly because he had always worked them. Wet ground near the creek. A dry ridge that seemed to give less every summer. A distant field that required 2 gates and a rough lane before a tractor even reached it. The farm had grown that way over 40 years. not according to one plan, piece by piece. Walter had come there at 23 with his father and 2 borrowed implements. They rented ground first, bought parcels when they could, added fields when an opportunity appeared. Every piece carried a history. The north field had once grown oats well enough that Walter's father bragged about it for years. The long slope beyond the machine shed had carried cattle when the grass was thicker. The 40 acres near the creek had flooded badly one spring, and never behaved quite the same afterward. Walter knew where a gate would freeze, first in January. He knew where the soil turned heavy beneath the top few inches. He knew which field dried quickly after rain, and which one could trap a tractor long after the surface looked firm. But knowing a farm was not the same as questioning it. For years, Walter had simply kept everything moving. Plant what could be planted. Cut what could be cut. Graze what could be grazed. Fix what broke. Make another pass if the first one wasn't enough. As long as the equipment ran, and Walter could put in the hours, the system kept going. Then Ruth died. The house changed before the farm did. Her mug remained beside the sink for almost a month. Her gardening gloves stayed on a nail near the back door through winter. Walter kept cooking too much food because after more than 40 years, he never learned how to make supper for one. Outside, the farm still demanded the same things. Fuel, fence, feed, seed, repairs, time. Only Walter had less help giving them. His son Michael lived 6 hours away. His daughter had built a life in another state. The seasonal hand Walter once called had taken steady work elsewhere. Nobody had made a dramatic decision to leave him alone. Life had simply reorganized itself. The farm had not. That was when his children began asking questions. Walter preferred not to answer. What happens if you get hurt? What happens if another machine breaks? What if you can't make hay when the weather gives you the window? What if another weak field costs more than it produces? Michael was the one who finally said it. You could sell part of it? Walter looked at him across the kitchen table. Not all of it. Just part. The distant ground. The weakest acres. Enough to reduce taxes. Repairs. Fuel. And work. Walter understood the logic. That was what bothered him. Selling no longer sounded like failure. It sounded efficient. A month later, a real estate agent came by. He wore clean boots. Walter noticed that immediately. The man talked about road frontage, soil classifications, parcel size, and development pressure. Then he pointed toward the west pasture. That section might be worth more outside agriculture. Walter followed his finger. The pasture was thin in places. Brush had pushed in along the fence. One corner stayed too wet for equipment after heavy rain. On paper, the agent had a point, but Walter remembered that ground differently. He remembered cattle standing belly-deep in grass, his father cutting hay near the ridge, water appearing in a narrow line through the lower ground every wet spring, even before the creek rose. The pasture had not always been poor. It had changed. Walter had watched that happen slowly enough that he had never treated it like an event. One weak season became another. A wet patch became a nuisance. A dry ridge became a place that needed more seed. When something produced less, Walter added something. More fertilizer. Another pass. Another repair. Another year. He had spent decades learning how to work the farm. He was no longer sure he had spent enough time learning why parts of it had stopped working back. That thought stayed with him after the agent drove away. Now, with both tractors dead, it returned. Walter stood at the kitchen window and looked across the fields. Selling would solve real problems. It would reduce the taxes, the fuel, the fences, the machinery, the number of acres one 67-year-old man was expected to think about before breakfast. But selling would also answer a question Walter had only just begun to ask. Was the farm failing because the land had nothing left to give? Or because he had spent too many years asking every acre to give in the same way? The next morning, Walter did not go straight to the equipment shed. He put on his oldest boots. Then he started walking west. Walter spent the next 2 days trying to bring the larger tractor back to life. It was the machine he trusted most. Older than some of the men working neighboring farms. Heavy enough to pull the equipment he needed. Simple enough that Walter still understood most of what was happening under the hood. At least he thought he did. He rolled his tools across the concrete floor of the equipment shed and started with the transmission housing. The oil he'd drained the week before had told him something was wrong. Too dark. Too much metal in it. Walter ran a magnet through the bottom of the pan and watched gray fragments gather along the edge. That was when he stopped pretending it was going to be a cheap repair. Still, he kept going. He removed the seat, pulled the floor plate, disconnected lines that hadn't moved in years. Every bolt fought him. Some came free with penetrating oil and patience. Others needed heat. One rounded off completely, forcing Walter to cut a slot into the head and work it loose a fraction of a turn at a time. By noon, his back hurt. By 3, his hands were shaking slightly from holding tools too long. He ignored both. The tractor had broken before. Machines always broke. You fixed them. That was what farmers did. Walter had spent most of his life solving problems by staying with them longer than anyone else wanted to. A broken hydraulic line meant replacing the line. A bad bearing meant pressing in another bearing. A cracked weld meant grinding it clean and doing it again. There was comfort in that kind of problem. A machine was honest. Something was broken. You found it. You repaired it. The land was harder. The farm was harder. So Walter concentrated on the tractor. Late that afternoon, he found the damaged gear. 2 teeth were badly worn. One was chipped. Walter sat on an overturned bucket and stared at it. He knew what came next. Phone calls, parts yards, waiting. Maybe a used assembly if he could find one. Maybe more damage deeper inside. He called a salvage dealer in the next county. No match. Another dealer had something close. But not close enough. A third man told him he might know where one was. What year is yours? Walter told him. The man went quiet. You still running that thing? Walter looked at the open tractor behind him. I was. The man laughed once. Not cruelly. Then he gave Walter a price. Walter wrote it down on the back of an old feed receipt. When the call ended, he read the number twice. It wasn't impossible. That was the dangerous part. He could pay it. Then pay freight. Then replace the seals while he had everything open. Then deal with whatever else he found once the housing came apart. And even if the tractor ran again, the second one was still sitting dead in the north field. Walter walked into the house after dark and spread his bills across the kitchen table. Fuel, property tax, fence supplies, veterinary costs, repairs from the previous season, a payment still due on equipment he barely used anymore. He added the tractor estimate, then he sat there without moving. For years, the farm had answered every problem the same way. More fuel, more parts, more iron, more acres worked faster. Walter had never questioned it because when he was 40, he could make up for bad decisions with time. At 50, he could make up for them with longer days. At 67, there wasn't enough body left to hide inefficiency. That realization irritated him more than the repair bill. The next morning, Walter went back to the shed. He picked up the wrench, then stopped. Through the open door, he could see the road leading toward the west pasture. The greener strip he'd noticed 2 days earlier was somewhere beyond the ridge. The tractor could wait another hour. Walter set the wrench down. For the first time since both machines had failed, he chose not to repair anything. He started walking, and that decision bothered him all the way across the first field. Because somewhere deep down, Walter still believed that a farmer who wasn't fixing something was wasting time. Walter reached the west pasture a little after 8. It took longer than he expected. From a tractor seat, the distance between the equipment shed and the west fence barely registered. You shifted gears, watched the ruts, and arrived, on foot. Every rise had a slope. Every low place held its own temperature. Every gate was farther apart than memory suggested. Walter stopped beside the strip of green grass he had noticed 2 mornings earlier. Up close, it was narrower than he'd imagined, maybe 15 feet across at its widest point, running in an uneven line down the lower edge of the pasture. The surrounding grass was thinner and duller. Walter crouched. He pulled back the blades with one hand and pushed his fingers into the soil. The top inch was dry. Below that, it was cool. He moved 20 feet uphill and tried again. Harder, drier. He returned to the green strip. Cool again. Walter stood, and looked toward the creek. It was too far away to explain the moisture directly. There was no visible ditch, no broken pipe, no standing water, just greener grass following a shallow depression through the pasture. He had seen it before. That bothered him, not the grass itself, the fact that he'd seen it without noticing it. For years, this pasture had been something to cross, mow, grazen, or repair. He had known where the rocks were because they could damage equipment. He knew where the ground stayed soft because a tractor could get stuck. He knew which gates needed lifting before they would close. But those were machine problems. Walter realized he had spent years reading the farm according to what the equipment needed. Now the equipment wasn't moving, so he kept walking. Near the upper fence, the soil changed again. The grass grew shorter, but several deep-rooted plants held their color better than the shallow grass around them. Along another slope, rain had cut narrow channels through bare soil. Walter followed one downhill. The channel disappeared into a patch of thicker vegetation. He knelt and rubbed the soil between his fingers. More organic matter, less powder. At the next fence line, old posts ran at an angle that made no sense with the current field. Walter stopped. He remembered then, there had been another paddock there decades earlier. His father had divided the pasture differently. Walter had removed most of the interior fencing when larger machinery became part of the operation. Larger fields had been easier to work. Fewer corners, fewer gates, longer passes. At the time, it had felt like progress. Walter rested both hands on the top wire and looked across the pasture. Something uncomfortable was beginning to form in his mind. The farm had not always been arranged for the land. Over time, parts of it had been arranged for the machines. He walked farther south. A stand of brush had spread near the tree line, but beneath it the ground was covered. A heavily traveled lane near the barn was bare and packed hard. One field that Walter considered poor had decent vegetation around its margins and almost nothing in the center. Another field had an old swale-like depression that caught runoff after storms. Walter didn't have explanations yet. He had differences. That was enough. Back at the house, he took an old property map from a drawer. For the first time, he didn't look at acreage totals. He took a pencil and began marking places. A circle around the green strip, a line where erosion was cutting, an X beside the compacted lane, a note near the old fence. Stays wet, dries early, better grass, bar center. By noon, the map looked messy. Walter stared at it. 900 acres had always appeared simple on paper. One number, one property, one problem. But the marks were beginning to tell him something else. The farm wasn't failing evenly. Some places were struggling, some were holding on, and a few seemed to be doing better precisely where Walter had been doing less. He looked through the kitchen window toward the machine shed. The tractor was still apart. The repair hadn't changed, but the problem had. For the first time, Walter wondered whether trying to fix the whole farm at once had been the mistake, and if it was, then 900 acres was no longer the number he needed to solve. Walter spent most of that afternoon at the kitchen table. The property map lay open beneath his hands. For years, he had used maps to measure acres, mark boundaries, record crops, and calculate how much. The map told him where the farm was. It did not tell him how the farm behaved. So Walter stopped looking at the printed lines. He looked at his pencil marks instead. The green strip in the west pasture, the dry ridge above it, the slope where rain carried soil downhill, the packed lane near the barn, the distant field that took nearly as much fuel to reach as it did to work. Walter pulled a yellow legal pad toward him and drew 5 boxes. He wrote, "Work. Now. Use lightly. Rest. Water. Problem." Then he began dividing the farm in a way he never had before. The south field went under work now. Not because Walter could work it that morning. Both tractors were still dead. But if he repaired one machine, borrowed equipment, or paid someone for a necessary pass, that field would get the money first. Good access, reliable ground, few drainage problems. If Walter had only so much fuel, so much time, and so much strength left, the south field could still earn its place. The west pasture went under US lightly. There was forage there, but not evenly. Some sections could carry cattle. Others needed time. The upper ridge went under rest. Walter stared at the word before writing it. For most of his life, unused ground had felt like wasted ground. If a field looked weak, you worked it harder. Disc it, seed it, fertilize it, mow what came up. Try again next year. But every attempt required something from him. Diesel, parts, seed, hours. And lately the weakest acres seemed to demand the most, while returning the least. He circled the green strip and wrote water. He still did not know why the soil stayed cooler there. Maybe runoff followed the shallow depression. Maybe water moved beneath the surface. Maybe it meant nothing beyond one wet spring. Walter refused to turn an observation into an answer, but he could at least stop driving across it as if it behaved like everything around it. Then he reached the far field. He had farmed it for years because it belonged to him. That was almost the entire argument. The ground was inconsistent. Access was poor. 3 seasons in a row. Walter had told himself the next crop would recover what the last one had lost. It never had. He wrote problem beside it, then sat back. 900 acres had always sounded like one number. One farm. One responsibility. That afternoon, Walter finally saw the lie inside it. An acre near the barn was not the same as an acre across 2 gates and a rough road. A wet hollow was not the same as a dry ridge. Good pasture was not the same as ground that swallowed fertilizer and still came back thin. Yet Walter had spent years treating ownership as obligation. If he owned it, he worked it. If it struggled, he spent more. The tractors had made that possible. Horsepower could flatten differences. Bigger equipment crossed bad ground faster, opened wider fields, and made 900 uneven acres look almost uniform from the cab. Without the machines, the differences became impossible to ignore. The next morning, Walter carried 4 wooden stakes from the barn. He drove one beside the south field, one near the west pasture, one at the dry ridge. Then he walked to the entrance of the far field. He pushed the 4th stake halfway into the soil, stopped, and pulled it back out. He would not work that field this season. No fertilizer, no fuel. No repair bill justified by the argument that he had always done it. Walter stood there longer than he expected. A younger man might have called the decision surrender. At 67, Walter was beginning to see it as triage. If every acre demanded equal attention, 900 acres would finish him before he finished the farm. So he stopped asking how to work all of it. He asked a harder question: which acres had actually earned the right to cost him something? For the first time in months, the farm felt smaller, not because Walter had sold a single acre, because 900 acres was no longer one impossible problem. It was a collection of choices, and some of them were finally allowed to wait. For 3 weeks, Walter did almost nothing to the upper ridge. It was harder than working it. Every morning, he could see the pale rise beyond the west pasture from his kitchen window. In previous years, he would have mowed it before the weeds grew tall, then found some way to seed the thin places. A field was supposed to look managed. The ridge did not, but Walter had written rest on the map, so he left it alone. Then the rain came. Not a storm, just a slow spring rain that lasted most of an afternoon. The next morning, Walter walked the ridge with a screwdriver in his pocket. On the exposed slope, water had cut narrow channels through the soil. Fine dirt had collected several yards downhill. Walter crouched beside one. The surface had already begun forming a crust. 20 feet away, old grass and dead plant material still covered the ground. He pulled the residue back. The soil beneath it was darker, cooler. He pushed the screwdriver down. It went nearly twice as deep before resistance stopped it. Walter tried again. Bare ground, then covered ground. The difference remained. He wrote 2 words on the legal pad: Huslonger. For most of his life, residue had looked like unfinished work. A clean field meant somebody cared, but the cleanest part of the ridge had lost water fastest. That bothered him. So did what he found near the upper fence. A thick patch of weeds had expanded while he was leaving the field alone. Walter stood over them. Carl Bennett had warned him this would happen. For a moment, Walter felt the old instinct return. Get the mower. Knock everything down. Clean it up before it spread. Then he stopped. The tractor was still dead. And more importantly, Walter had promised himself that he would stop treating every ugly thing as an emergency. He pulled one of the plants, roots and all, and carried it back toward the barn. He didn't know yet whether the patch was harmless, useful, or something that could become a larger problem. That uncertainty mattered. Resting a field was not the same as abandoning it. Doing less did not mean paying less attention. Over the next 2 weeks, Walter returned after rain and after heat. Some sections held moisture longer, others still hardened quickly. New growth appeared through old cover near the lower edge. The weed patch continued spreading. The ridge was not healing evenly. Walter began marking those differences on the map. Cover. Hard. Hose water. Watch weeds. He avoided conclusions. One wet spring could make bad ground look good. One dry month could expose every mistake. But one thing was becoming difficult to ignore. The areas he had disturbed least were often the areas asking the least from him. No diesel, no seed, no repair bill. And still, some of them were holding moisture better than the ground he had worked hardest the year before. Walter stood on the ridge one evening and looked toward the equipment shed. For decades, when a field struggled, his first question had been, what should I put on it? Seed? Fertilizer? Fuel? Labor? Now he was asking something different. What am I doing to this ground that makes it need so much from me? He still didn't know the answer. And the weeds reminded him that doing nothing could create problems of its own. But that was useful too. Walter was beginning to understand that the choice was not between working the land and abandoning it. There was something in between. Watch. Test. Interfere only when the ground gave him a reason. The ridge was no longer a field he had given up on. It had become the first place on the farm where Walter allowed the land to answer before he did. Walter had 12 cattle left. 12 animals could not manage 900 acres. Walter understood that, but they might help him manage the acres that still made sense. The west pasture was the obvious place to begin. Some sections carried decent forage. Others were thin. One corner stayed damp after rain. Brush was pushing in along the fence. For years, Walter had opened the gate and let the cattle decide where to spend their time. They usually made the same choices. They ate the best plants first, returned to them when they grew back, avoided the rougher patches, and stayed too long near water. Walter found several rolls of temporary fence in the barn. Some posts were bent. Several insulators were cracked. The old energizer still worked. That was enough. He divided part of the pasture into smaller sections. Nothing precise. Just enough fence to control where 12 cattle could go. The first morning, they stared at the wire. Then they lowered their heads and started eating. Walter watched. They clipped some plants, ignored others, trampled taller grass, dropped manure across places where Walter would never have bothered driving a spreader. That caught his attention. A mower could cut plants. A spreader could move nutrients. Both required diesel. The cattle were already doing pieces of those jobs. So Walter left them there. One day, then another. On the third afternoon, the sky darkened. Walter saw the storm coming and considered moving them. There was still plenty of forage standing. His old instinct won. One more night. The rain arrived after midnight. By morning, Walter knew he had made a mistake. The ground around the water trough had turned to mud. Hooves had punched deep holes into the soft soil. A narrow lane the cattle used repeatedly was churned almost bare. Several plants had been grazed much shorter than Walter intended. He stood beside the damaged patch with rainwater soaking through his boots. This was not regeneration. It was pressure in the wrong place for too long. Walter moved the cattle that morning. Then he moved the water trough. He shortened the next grazing period. The following section still had grass standing when he opened the fence and moved them again. That bothered him. Leaving feed behind looked wasteful, but the muddy patch behind him looked worse. So he began paying attention to something he had rarely measured before. Time. Not how many acres the animals could cover, how long the ground could tolerate them before benefit became damage. Small section. Short stay. Move. Then leave it alone. A week later, Walter returned to the first paddock. The damaged area near the old water point still looked rough. He marked it on the map. Watch. But farther away, where the cattle had passed without lingering. Residue still covered much of the soil. After another rain, green shoots began pushing through the flattened grass. Walter knelt. The ground beneath the residue was cool. He thought about the ridge. Different field. Same lesson. Cover mattered. So did recovery. Walter repeated the rotation. But more carefully, he moved water before the ground became beaten down. He watched the weather. When soil was wet, he moved the cattle sooner. When forage was short, he did not ask the pasture for one more day, simply because grass remained. The system was not automatic. The animals were not free labor. They still needed water. Fence needed repair. Walter had to watch them every day. But something had changed in the way he thought about work. Before, he saw a job and reached for a machine. Cut the grass. Spread nutrients. Control where animals grazed. Clean up what remained. Now he asked a different question first. What function did the farm need? Sometimes the answer was still a tractor. But sometimes, 12 cattle, a few hundred yards of wire, and enough recovery time could do part of the job without starting an engine. Carl Bennett noticed the temporary fences one evening. He slowed his pickup beside the road. You farming with fence wire now? Walter pushed a post into the ground. Trying to. Carl looked toward the cattle. Seems like a lot of moving around. Walter glanced at the muddy patch he had learned from. It is if you do it wrong. Carl laughed and drove on. Walter stayed by the fence. One tractor was still dead in the north field. The larger one was still open inside the shed. Neither fact had changed. But parts of the west pasture were beginning to ask less from him, not because the cattle had saved the farm. 12 animals could not do that. What they had done was teach Walter something the tractors never had. Power was not the same as horsepower, and every tool on a farm became expensive when you used it longer than the land could afford. By late summer, Walter's farm looked worse from the road. One tractor still sat in the north field, weeds rising around its rear tire. The larger machine remained open inside the equipment shed. The upper ridge had not been mowed. Temporary fence crossed the west pasture in crooked lines. The far field had not been touched all season. For 40 years, Walter had believed a farm should show evidence of the farmer. Straight rows, freshly cut grass, clean fence lines, machinery moving. Now some of the ground he watched most carefully looked like ground nobody cared about. Other people noticed. At the feed store, a man Walter had known for years watched him load mineral into a cart. Heard you're cutting back? Some. How much? Walter thought about the map on his kitchen table. Depends which acres you're asking about. The man smiled. Walter knew that smile. It was the smile people gave when they believed an old man had found a gentler word for quitting. A few days later, Carl Bennett stopped beside the west fence. Walter was moving cattle. Carl looked past him toward the upper ridge. You ever going to mow that? Maybe. That weed patch is getting bigger. I know. And the backfield? Leaving it. Carl rested an arm on the truck window. You keep leaving things long enough, they'll stop being a farm. Walter looked toward the ridge. Carl wasn't entirely wrong. That was what made the words difficult to dismiss. The weed patch had spread. One paddock near the old water point was still recovering from Walter's mistake with the cattle. The fields he had stopped working were not magically improving because he had decided to call the neglect rest. Some areas were responding, others were simply waiting, and Walter still did not know which would be which by next spring. I'm watching it, he said. Carl glanced across hundreds of acres. That's a lot of farm to watch. Then he drove away. Walter stood beside the fence after the dust settled. That part was true too. 900 acres was still 900 acres. Changing the way he thought about the number had not made the fences shorter or the taxes smaller. In August, Michael came home. He walked into the equipment shed before carrying his bag inside. The larger tractor was exactly where he had seen it months earlier. Seat removed. Floor open. Parts arranged on the bench. Michael stopped. You still haven't fixed it? No. What about the other one? Still out there. Michael looked toward the north field. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Michael said, Dad, I don't understand. Walter knew he didn't mean the tractor. They walked the farm that evening. Walter showed him the ridge he had left alone, the places that held moisture longer beneath cover. The weed patch he was watching. The damaged ground near the old water point. He showed him where the cattle had stayed too long and where shorter grazing had left more residue behind. He showed him the far field he had decided not to spend money on. Michael listened without interrupting. When they reached the west pasture, he looked across the temporary fences. "So you're farming less?" Walter considered it. He was making fewer tractor passes, working fewer acres directly, buying less fuel, leaving more vegetation standing from the road. Michael was right. "I'm doing less work," Walter said. Michael looked at him. "That's not the same thing?" "No." Walter pointed toward the paddocks. "I used to decide what machine I needed before I decided whether the job needed doing." Michael said nothing. Walter continued. "I'm trying not to do that anymore." Michael looked toward the dead tractor. "And if this doesn't work?" There it was. The question Walter had been asking himself all summer. Not whether the grass looked better, not whether the soil stayed cooler, whether any of it could keep the farm financially alive. Walter had no proof yet. "Then I was wrong." Michael studied his father. "You'd sell?" Walter looked across the pasture. "If the numbers tell me to." That answer surprised both of them. Months earlier, Walter would have defended the farm before looking at the numbers. Now he was beginning to understand that keeping land and saving a farm were not always the same thing. The next morning, Michael left. Before climbing into his truck, he pointed toward the north field. "You know that tractor makes the place look abandoned." Walter looked at it. Weeds had nearly reached the axle. "I know." "You going to move it?" "Eventually." Michael shook his head, smiled slightly, and drove away. Walter watched until the truck disappeared. Then he walked back toward the pasture. From the county road, the farm still looked like it was losing ground. Maybe that was unavoidable. People could see the dead tractors. They could see the uncut ridge. They could see fields Walter had stopped working. What they could not see was the ledger in his kitchen. They could not see the fuel he had not burned, the parts he had not bought, the acres he had stopped paying to fight. Walter had spent most of his life measuring progress by how much work he could put into the land. Now he was beginning to measure something else, how much work the land could stop demanding from him. And before the summer was over, that difference would finally show up somewhere. Walter could not argue with. On paper, Walter noticed the change in a metal box. Not in the grass, not in the cattle, not even in the soil. In receipts, he had kept them in the same dented box for nearly 20 years. Diesel, hydraulic oil, fence staples, mineral, seed, parts, repairs. At the end of each month, Walter sat at the kitchen table and added them up. Most years, August was where the numbers began to hurt. That evening, he finished the total, then did it again. The number was lower than he expected. Walter pulled out the previous year's receipts and spread them beside the new ones. The difference was not one miracle expense. It was dozens of smaller expenses that had never happened. Fewer trips with equipment, less diesel, no fertilizer on the far field, no seed thrown at ground he had already classified as a problem, no mower running across the ridge simply because August had arrived. The temporary fencing had cost money, so had repairs to the water setup. The cattle still needed mineral. The farm had not become cheap, but for the first time in years, Walter could see money he had saved by deciding not to do something. He circled the total, then looked toward the equipment shed. The larger tractor was still apart. Months earlier, Walter had treated that machine as an emergency. He had priced the gear, freight, seals. The additional parts he might as well replace once the housing was open. He found the old estimate beneath a stack of bills, then placed it beside the month's receipts. Walter sat back. If he had repaired the tractor immediately, he knew what would have happened. He would have used it. Not because every pass was necessary, because once a machine was running, there was always something that could be done with it. A field to mow, a rough patch to disc, a distant acre that looked unfinished. Walter had spent years thinking machinery saved labor. Sometimes it did. But machinery also made unnecessary work easier to justify. The next morning, he walked the west pasture. The cattle had moved again the day before. Behind them, grass remained standing in places. Flattened residue covered others. Near the old water point, the damaged patch from his mistake was still visible. Walter did not ignore it. The soil there had taught him what happened when animals stayed too long. Farther across the pasture, where he had shortened the rotations, the ground looked different. Not transformed, not restored, just better protected. He pushed the screwdriver into the soil, then crossed the temporary fence and tried again. He wrote the result on his pad. No celebration, just another mark. Later that week, a brief rain passed over the farm. Walter returned the following morning. Water had disappeared quickly from the exposed lane. Under the heavier pasture cover, moisture remained. The same pattern he had seen on the ridge, 2 different places, 2 different management choices. The same lesson. The farm was beginning to pay him in 2 ways. Some acres were costing less. 1. Others were beginning to hold on to more of what they already had. Water, cover, forage, time. Walter understood the difference. Saving diesel was not the same as rebuilding soil. Leaving a field alone did not guarantee recovery. 12 cattle were not going to repair 900 acres. And one good season did not prove he had found the answer. But Walter no longer needed the whole farm to prove him right at once. That had been the old mistake. 900 acres had once been one number. Now each section had to justify what Walter asked from it and what he spent on it. The south field still deserved attention. The west pasture was beginning to carry itself with fewer machine hours. The ridge was still an experiment. The far field had cost him almost nothing because Walter had finally stopped trying to force it to repay him. That evening, he opened his legal pad. Beside each section, he added another column. Cost. Not value. Not yield. Cost. He began estimating what each part of the farm had demanded from him that season. Fuel. Labor. Fence. Feed. Repairs. Time. When he finished, Walter noticed something that would have seemed backward a year earlier. The acres that looked least impressive from the road were not necessarily the acres hurting him most. Some were simply resting. The dangerous acres were the ones that could consume money year after year while still looking like they were being farmed. Walter closed the pad. Outside, the dead tractor in the north field was disappearing deeper into the weeds. For the first time, he did not look at it as a symbol of failure. It was a machine that needed a decision. Nothing more. Walter had spent 40 years asking how much work he could get from 900 acres. Now the farm was forcing him to ask a better question. How much of those 900 acres could earn the work he put into them? The answer was still incomplete. But that summer, for the first time, a few acres had answered him back. Not with a record harvest. With something Walter needed more. Margin. Walter waited until September before touching the tractor again. By then, he had enough distance from the problem to see it differently. In spring, the machine had felt like an emergency. Now it was just a machine. That changed everything. He cleared the workbench, wiped dust from the damaged parts, and unfolded the repair estimate he had kept pinned beneath a coffee mug. The number still bothered him, but it no longer frightened him. Walter made 3 calls. The first was to the salvage dealer who had quoted him months earlier. The second was to a retired mechanic named Earl Mercer, who had worked on farm equipment long before diagnostic laptops became common. The third was to a farmer 2 counties over who was parting out a machine from the same series. By the end of the week, Walter had found what he needed. Not new, not pretty, but usable. Earl arrived on a Tuesday morning in a faded pickup carrying more tools than Walter thought one man could own. He looked at the open tractor and whistled. You really took her apart. Walter handed him a cup of coffee. Head time. Earl crouched beside the transmission housing. You sure you want to put money back into this thing? Walter looked toward the fields. Not like before. Earl glanced up. What does that mean? It means I don't need it to do everything. That answer seemed to interest him more than the tractor. They worked slowly. Walter handled the parts he could. Earl took over when the work required more strength or precision than Walter trusted himself to provide. There was no pride in pretending. Not anymore. They replaced the damaged gear, changed seals, inspected the bearings, flushed the housing. One worn line became another repair. Then, a cracked hose. Then, a fitting Walter almost ignored until Earl pointed to the wetness around the threads. The old version of Walter would have grown angry at every new problem, This time, he wrote each one down. The tractor would either earn its place on the farm or it wouldn't. 3 days later, they were ready. Walter climbed into the seat. The cab smelled exactly the way he remembered. Dust, oil, old vinyl warmed by the sun. He put one hand on the wheel and turned the key. The starter rolled. The engine coughed. Stopped. Walter looked down. Earl raised one finger from the ground. Again. Walter turned the key. The engine rolled twice. Caught hard. Then filled the shed with a deep, uneven rumble. Walter did not smile immediately. He listened. Oil pressure. Idle. A slight vibration. Then the engine settled. For months, he had imagined this sound as victory. Instead, what he felt was relief. Nothing more. He drove the tractor out of the shed and stopped in the yard. The north field lay in one direction, the west pasture in another. 900 acres opened around him. In spring, he would have driven straight toward the biggest unfinished job. Now he shut the tractor off. Earl stared at him. Something wrong? No. You just fixed it. I know. Walter climbed down. He walked into the house and came back with the marked property map. He spread it across the tractor hood. There were circles, notes, lines, dates, and crossed-out field numbers. Walter pointed to the south field. That needs it. Then to a narrow access lane. That too. He moved his finger across 3 other fields. Those don't. Earl looked at him for a moment. You spent half the summer fixing the farm without fixing the tractor. Walter folded the map. Looks that way. Over the next several weeks, the tractor worked fewer hours than Walter would once have thought acceptable. It moved material where moving material actually mattered, handled jobs the cattle couldn't do, helped repair an access point, pulled equipment only across ground Walter had already decided deserved the fuel. He stopped measuring the machine's value by how many acres it covered. He measured it by how many unnecessary hours it avoided. The change was subtle, but it was the difference between owning a tool and serving one. At sunset one evening, Walter parked the tractor beside the equipment shed. Across the yard, the second tractor still sat dead. For the first time all year, Walter did not look at it as unfinished business. He looked at it and understood something he should have learned years earlier. A farm could use a tractor. That did not mean it had to be built around one. The first machine had come back to life. But the bigger change was that Walter no longer needed it to bring the farm back with it. By the second spring, Walter stopped talking about the farm as if it were one thing. The language had changed before he noticed it. He no longer said, "The west field." He said, "The grazing section." He no longer said, "The bad 40." He said, "The ground I'm resting." The low area near the creek became the wet ground. The south field became the field that pays. The ridge became the cover ground. The words mattered because the decisions behind them had changed. For most of Walter's life, land had been judged by one question. What could it produce? Now he asked something else. What was this piece of ground good at doing? Some acres answered quickly. The south field continued to justify the fuel and time he put into it. The west pasture improved enough to carry the cattle longer between supplemental feedings. The ridge did not become productive cropland. Walter stopped expecting it to. Instead, he left more cover standing, watched runoff after storms, and used it carefully. The wet strip near the lower pasture remained wet. That was not a failure either. Walter quit trying to force equipment through it at the wrong time. He fenced part of it off when the soil was soft, and let the vegetation hold the ground together. The change was not dramatic from the county road. There was no single season when 900 acres suddenly turned green. No photograph could have explained it. But the farm began costing Walter less effort to keep alive. That was the difference. He noticed it in small things. The tractor ran fewer hours. His fuel tank lasted longer. He bought less hay than he once expected to. Fewer emergency repairs appeared on machinery that was no longer pushed across every field simply because it was available. The temporary fences became more permanent in a few places. Others disappeared when Walter realized they were unnecessary. Even the map changed. The original property lines were still there, but over them were Walter's notes. Arrows showing how water moved. Dates showing when cattle entered and left. Circles around places that recovered slowly. Crosses over ground he had stopped fighting. The map no longer told him what he owned. It told him how the farm behaved. One morning, Michael came back. He parked beside the barn and stood looking at the large tractor. It was dusty but running. The second tractor remained where it had been for more than a year. Michael glanced toward it. "You ever going to fix that one?" Walter shrugged. "Don't need to." They walked toward the west pasture. Michael stopped at the fence. The difference wasn't spectacular. That mattered to Walter. He didn't want spectacular. He wanted repeatable. The cattle were spread across fresh forage. Behind them, the previous section was resting. The ground between plants was less exposed than Michael remembered. The old wet corner had been left alone. "What did you put on this?" Michael asked. Walter looked at the pasture. "Less than I used to." Michael laughed. "I'm serious." "So will we?" They continued toward the ridge. Walter showed him where rain used to cut through bare ground. The channels were still visible in places, but smaller. Vegetation now covered sections. Walter once would have worked aggressively. Michael looked across the property. "So you brought it back?" Walter shook his head. "Not the way it was." That was important. The old farm had depended on Walter being younger. It depended on machinery being available, on fuel being affordable enough, on every season giving him enough time to make another pass. That system had worked until it didn't. Walter had not restored it. He had removed pieces of it, reduced others, changed the order of decisions. Some acres now produced directly. Some fed animals. Some protected water. Some rested. Some waited. And a few Walter had finally accepted might never deserve the money he once poured into them. 900 acres still surrounded him. But they no longer felt like 900 acres demanding the same thing. That afternoon, Michael stood beside the truck before leaving. "You know," he said, "last year I thought you were shutting the place down." Walter looked toward the fields. "So did I." Michael smiled. "What changed?" Walter took a moment before answering. "I quit trying to save all of it the same way." After Michael drove away, Walter walked toward the equipment shed. The repaired tractor sat inside. The second one remained outside. Rust spreading slowly along the hood. A year earlier, Walter had looked at 2 dead tractors and seen proof that the farm was finished. Now one machine ran. One did not, and the farm no longer cared. That was when Walter knew it had finally come back. The second tractor never moved. By early fall, grass had grown high around the rear axle. Dust covered the hood. One tire had gone soft enough that Walter could see the sidewall beginning to fold near the ground. For months, he had walked past it with the same thought. "Later, I'll get to it later." But later kept coming, and Walter kept finding better things to do. He repaired a section of fence near the west pasture, moved cattle, cleared a blocked water line, checked the south field, marked another wet area on the map, greased the tractor that still ran. He stopped thinking about the dead machine for days at a time. That surprised him. A year earlier, it had represented everything that was going wrong. 2 broken tractors, too much land, not enough help, not enough time. At 67, Walter had seen the machine and thought it was proof that the farm had outlived him. Now it was just old steel sitting beside the barn. One afternoon, Carl Bennett pulled into the yard. He got out of his truck carrying a small box of fence staples Walter had asked him to pick up in town. Carl set the box on the tailgate and nodded toward the dead tractor. "You ever gonna fix that thing?" Walter followed his gaze. "Probably not." Carl looked at him. Walter could tell the answer surprised him. "You could still get parts." "Probably. Earl could help you?" "I know." Carl waited. "So why leave it?" Walter looked across the yard toward the machine shed. Inside, the tractor he had repaired sat ready. Beyond it were the fields. Some green, some rough, some resting, some still giving him trouble. None were perfect. That no longer bothered him either. "Don't need it," Walter said. Carl laughed. "You've got 900 acres?" Walter looked at him. "No." Carl frowned. Walter pointed toward the west pasture. "I've got cattle ground over there." Then toward the south, ground worth working there. He pointed toward the ridge. "That stays covered." then toward the low ground. That holds water. So I quit fighting it. He looked toward the distant backfield, and some of it can wait. Carl stared across the farm. Walter smiled slightly. That's different from 900 acres. Carl didn't answer. Maybe he understood. Maybe he didn't. It didn't matter. After Carl left, Walter walked over to the dead tractor. He opened the cab door. A mouse had torn insulation from beneath the seat. The steering wheel was coated in dust. Walter sat down anyway. From there, the farm looked almost exactly the way it had the morning the tractor died. Same fences, some a barn, same hills, same tree line in the distance. But Walter was not looking at the same farm. He knew where water stayed after rain. He knew which pastures recovered quickly and which needed more rest. He knew which acres justified fuel, which ones consumed it, which problems deserved machinery, which ones could be solved with wire, animals, time, or simply restraint. The farm had become more complicated, and somehow easier. Walter ran one hand across the steering wheel. For decades, he had believed keeping a farm alive meant keeping everything moving. Machines, animals, fields, himself. If something stopped, you started it again. If something broke, you repaired it. If ground failed, you worked it harder. That had been the lesson of most of his life. The last year had taught him another one. Some things should be repaired. Some should be rested. Some should be used differently. And some should be allowed to stay broken. Walter climbed down from the tractor and shut the door. The sun was low enough to throw the machine's shadow across the yard. He walked toward the house. Halfway there, he stopped and looked back once. A year earlier, he had believed the only way to save the farm was to become the man he had been at 40. Stronger, faster, able to work until dark and start again before sunrise. He had failed at that, and the failure had saved him from trying. The farm came back because Walter finally stopped asking his 67-year-old body to carry 900 acres. He stopped asking every field to behave the same. Stopped asking machinery to solve problems it had helped hide. Stopped treating unused ground as wasted ground. Stopped confusing activity with progress. One tractor had returned to work. The other never would. Walter didn't need both. He no longer needed to prove that he could fix everything. Behind him, the dead tractor remained where it was. Ahead of him, cattle moved slowly through the evening grass. And for the first time in years, the farm did not look like something Walter was trying to keep alive. It looked like something that had learned how to live with him.